Across the globe, cities are confronting serious challenges, everything from environmental threats to rapidly rising population and overtaxed infrastructure. Ontario's capital city is among them, and it's looking to head off problems early with the help of a chief resilience officer. Eliot Capel is the first such officer, and he joins us now to explain what makes for a resilient city. Elliot, nice to meet you, and welcome here to TVO.
Thank you very much.
Well, just tell me about the job off the top, because this is a new thing. What is a chief resilience officer?
It's a good question. We basically have two parts to the role. The first is leading the development and implementation of a resilient strategy in Toronto, and the second is leading our participation in the Global 100 Resilient Cities Network.
Why do we need a resilient strategy in the City of Toronto?
Well, I mean, as recent events show, we can either prepare ahead of the storm or we can prepare after the storm.
But the suggestion is the storm is inevitable.
Yes.
So what is the storm, what is the inevitable storm that you are sort of on the lookout for right now that we need to prepare to be resilient in the face of?
Right. So I think cities, around the world are dealing with three sort of big factors, right? Urbanization, more people are living in cities now than ever. Climate change, and globalization, in that cities are more connected to one another. And it's in that context that the Rockefeller Foundation pioneered the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative. And all of the cities that are going through this process are using a standard set of tools to think about what resilience means for their city. In Toronto, we're seeing really sort of three areas of work come into crystallize. The first one is around 21st century shocks, right? What are the things that might happen in the city that we didn't see 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
Give me a for instance.
Cyber failure, infrastructure interdependencies, or migration.
This is all now part of your mission?
This is the things that we are looking at, that we're scoping out. The second, of course, is climate change adaptation, and that's really at the heart of what we'll be doing. And then the third one, which has been really interesting as we, basically everybody that we speak to circles around the equity issues in the city.
Meaning what?
Well, if you look at some of the work coming out of, for example, David Hilchansky at U of T, he shows very clearly
the three Torontos.
The three Torontos, exactly, right? The growing gap between the rich and the poor, and the impact that has on the social fabric of the city.
Now, you've had the job, what, a few weeks now?
It's been about 3 months.
3 months now, okay. I mean, what you have laid out here as your mission just seems enormously vast.
Yeah.
So I don't even know where you begin to do these where do you start?
Right, so what we're doing right now is what's called a preliminary resilience assessment. It's a process that 100 Resilient Cities is helping us with to narrow down. It's what I call the art of the possible, right? We need to balance ambition and realism in that this is a 2-year appointment, and we need to get a few things done if we're going to demonstrate to the City of Toronto that this is something that we should take on long term. I would say that, without committing ourselves to anything, because the strategy's not finished yet, I can say for absolute certain that climate change adaptation is going to be at the heart of that mandate.
Can you, again, give us a sort of if you've decided that that's part of what the mission is all about, give me one, for instance, as to how a resilient city would respond to climate change adaptation.
Right, so we often use the policy wonk words of mainstreaming climate change adaptation into the city, right? But when you break down what the city does, the services we deliver, the infrastructure we build, our operations, there are tons of opportunities to protect ourselves from climate change, to get ahead of the storm. Okay, for example, if you're building a transportation project, which we are doing many of at the moment, environmental assessments primarily focus on the impact that a piece of construction or infrastructure will have on the environment. But we don't really take into account what impact the climate change, the change in our environment is going to have on the asset. So that's one way that we could really improve city services and investments. And
just to be clear, I mean, you mentioned a little earlier about this 100 Resilient Cities things coming out of the Rockefeller Foundation and so on. Is there competition among you 100 as to see who could be the most resilient city in that list?
That's an interesting point. It's actually, I said there were two parts of the job, right? Developing the strategy and leading our participation in the network. And the job is structured that way because, there are two real challenges that cities are facing. The first one is that there are these new sort of issues like climate change and globalization that cut across government departments. That's one part of the job. The other part is that cities traditionally haven't learned a lot from one another, right? In a lot of these spaces.
Why is that?
I don't really know, but the 100 Resilient Cities Network is a platform for learning between cities, right? And it's a problem that was identified in the development of the program, and it's one that they're really proactively solving for. I can say already 3 months into the job, we have learned a ton from the other cities in the network.
Do I assume the 100 resilient cities are the biggest 100 cities in the world, or is it beyond that?
No, that's a good question. I mean, it was a competitive application process, so I think they received something in the order of 1,000 applications over 3 rounds for 100 cities. And they did pick, I think, a mix, right? And each city made a certain pitch. So, for example, of our Canadian peers, we have Calgary, Montreal, Vancouver, and Toronto in the network. I mean, Calgary is not one of the biggest cities in the world, but they made a compelling pitch to 100 resilient cities as to why they should be included.
And do they rank resiliency 1 to 100 through that list?
I don't think they do.
Because I do want to know what the most resilient city in the world would be considered to be by the experts.
Right. So when they define resilience, they talk about, or we talk about, shocks and stresses, right? So shocks are the big acute things that you see, hurricanes, for example. Stresses may be less obvious, but they're the chronic things that weaken the fabric of the city day to day. So one example I give, before moving back to Toronto, I lived in Johannesburg, and crime in the city is a major issue that weakens the fabric every day. It costs people every day, productivity, et cetera. So you can think about those 2 angles to the problem.
I guess I should ask whether Houston and or Miami are on that list.
I know Miami is, and they're in it with a group of other regional players. I don't think that Houston is on the list.
Because I guess we're finding out right now about how resilient or not that city is.
I suppose you could put it that way. I think the first thing that we, have to think of when we think about Houston at the moment is, compassion.
Of course.
For the people who are there.
Yeah, of course. We had in that chair this past Friday, Jennifer Keesmaat, the outgoing, and I guess that's a double entendre. She's the outgoing chief planner in so much as she is leaving, and she's also a very outgoing person. She was on the program talking about the flooding from Hurricane Harvey and what we're all learning about that, and I guess in part how resilient our cities are going to have to be in future as it relates to these weather anomalies. So let's show a clip of that and then we'll come back and chat, okay? Sheldon, roll the clip if you would.
Even if you do plan a resilient city, and no one is there yet, maybe the Dutch, because they've been dealing with water for a very long time, but even if you do build a resilient city, the kind of extreme weather events we're talking about right now are even beyond what you can plan to accommodate in a city. Like we're kind of way off the charts right now. But there's a middle point. And we learned our lesson very well in the Toronto region as a result of Hurricane Hazel. And you can look at maps of where housing was located in the region prior to Hurricane Hazel.
This is 1950s, I guess,
1950s, mid-50s. And you can look after, and one of the things that we've done, we've increased our floodplains, we've expropriated housing from those floodplains. There are lessons that we can learn. I read a couple of days ago in, I believe it was Bloomberg, that in Houston, in the past 4 years, they have built 8,100 houses in floodplains. Build houses in the floodplains, the house floods. Come on, people. Come on, people.
Yeah. Now, besides what would seem to be an obvious lesson, as you watch what happened with Harvey, any other lessons you're coming up with that we can apply here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think first of all, I think Jennifer Keesmaat's totally right, and she's correct on all the statements that she makes. But again, so I think there are a couple of things. I'll highlight 3 that come to mind. The first is the importance of climate change adaptation, right? I think, as Jennifer said, no city could have coped with the amount of rainfall that fell in Houston. But if we integrate resilience and adaptation into the way that we zone, we plan, we build, we'll be better off. And as I said before, it's about whether we do it before or after the storm. The second thing that I think about a lot in the case of Houston is the importance of ecosystems, right? As cities urbanize, there's a temptation to sort of pave over things. And I think it's important to keep in mind the value of our green infrastructure. And then the last thing, which is sort of, looking ahead is, again, I come back to the equity issue, that we know that more vulnerable neighborhoods suffer worse in shocks and tend to bounce back more slowly. So I think we should watch those things, and we should keep them in mind as we prepare for our own resilience strategy.
That was a huge lesson from Katrina in Louisiana, and I guess Irma in Florida. They're going to figure that out now as they go along. Jennifer mentioned the Hurricane Hazel incident from the mid-1950s, and Sheldon, let's bring these pictures up if we can. Here are the Toronto Islands, which were obviously a huge part of Hurricane Hazel all those many decades ago. And I mean, they had some pretty significant flooding on the islands earlier this year, which was atypical, given how often people like to go to these places, particularly in the summertime, and enjoy all of what the islands have to offer. Is there anything that could have been done differently in your estimation to avoid that kind of flooding?
Well, I think I don't like to second guess and think, what could we have done differently? I think we need to look forward and think about what our long-term resilience plan is for the island. The island's a great example, right? Because if you think about it in terms of like GDP or population, what's the impact of the Toronto Islands within the greater Toronto area economy? It's small, but emotionally, the islands are really important to Torontonians. I mean, how many people said it doesn't feel like summer has really started, right? And there are something in the order of hundreds of homes on the island. So to me, it's a great test case for us to apply resilience thinking and think about how we're going to have the island bounce back better.
Now, I want to know what your response is going to be the first time you go to the head of this department at City Hall, and then that department at City Hall, and then this department at City Hall, and each one of them says to you, "Oh, that's all very interesting, but that's her department, or that's his department,
right.
or that's not my department, or that's only my department, and I don't want to hear from anybody else on this." How do you resolve those turf wars to do your job properly?
Well, maybe I haven't been in the job long enough, but I have to say that so far people at City Hall have been receptive, to say the least. People are on board. There's a lot of support.
But they do operate in silos. They do all over government.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the nature of governments, and indeed that's one of the reasons why the program was created. So, I mean, there's some obvious things that we can do: capacity building, training, mainstreaming, working with the city departments. But I think fundamentally, as Jennifer said on your program on Friday, it's about building support. We could develop the most fantastic evidence-based resilience plan and plow forward in our own little silo. But if you really want to forge ahead with a change that's going to last in City Hall, it's about building support and carrying people along. People
obviously have resiliency, or not, but to a greater or lesser extent in their own lives. But I'm not sure they ever think about it on a citywide basis, like how resilient is an entire city when it tries to come back from something. We've had a few brushes with this in the past. The power failure, I think, that took place many, many years ago. Obviously bad weather and, make your own list. How do you get people to look at this as a citywide issue as opposed to something that's just maybe happening in their lives alone?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think, as the list that you mentioned, the blackout, ice storm, flooding, really focused on climate events, which are important. But I would add to that list something like SARS, which was a big shock to the city economy and to our society. Yeah. So I think that, it's really not a terribly hard sell at the moment, given what's in the news, given the way that people feel about the island, to get them to really think about resilience and hold on to the topic.
When you, and I don't know if this is part of your mission, but maybe you can tell me, do you want people, having watched this, to, do anything, prepare anything, change the way they live in order to be more resilient as a city?
Well, I think we want to engage, first of all, there's a balance, right? There's a balance between Canadian-style laissez-faire and this sort of hysteria of stocking up. We're going to try and find that balance in the strategy, what we communicate to businesses and to people in the community. I think we're hoping that people will be engaged, in the development of the strategy. We want to hear from Torontonians what they think is important. I was reading, we have a survey that's up online, and I was reading through the first 100 responses. And, when we think about resilience, and as we've talked about it today, there's been a lot of focus on climate change, a lot of focus on disasters. Of the first 100, I would say at least 2/3 focused on diversity.
Interesting.
And saying diversity is our strength, and how do we leverage diversity to be a more resilient city?
Okay, let's finish up on this then. When you and I are sitting here 5 years from now, and you are looking back at what your office either did or did not accomplish, what's on your list?
Well, I think the top of the list, again, is about climate change adaptation, right? Putting that at the center of government, something that can work across the government and across governments with the province, with our neighboring municipalities. I think that's really core to the agenda. Another aspect that I think is really important on the equity side is working on tower and neighborhood renewal. A lot of people in the city live in apartment buildings that were built before 1985. There are 1,200 of them in the city. And I think that there's a big resilience challenge there and an opportunity to build climate adaptation in those communities, but also to build social and economic resilience. So that's an area that I think is very important.
Gotcha. Where did your mom work for 25 years?
My mother worked at City Hall.
And where did you swear you would never work?
City Hall.
And where do you work now?
City Hall.
There you go. Life's funny, eh?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's Eliot Capel. He is the first Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Toronto. Thanks, Eliot.
Thanks, Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.